Hello, everyone, and welcome to the new academic year. I'm very pleased to start our series of talks with Rebecca. I'm so sorry, my colleague is Roberta. So we're slightly shifting the focus of our talks. Last year, if you remember, we had a series of talks on quantitative methods in psychological, sometimes biomedical sciences, which is very useful, and we're going to do this this year too. However, we're also expanding the repertoire of our talks and talking more about qualitative research, especially in organizational studies. So what can be done if probably the reproducibility concept may not be fully transferred to organizational studies. However, there must be certain things which we could do in whole research to ensure to increase the transparency and enhance robustness of our research. And with this purpose, I have invited Rebecca Whiting from Birkbeck Business School, and Rebecca is a well-known researcher in organizational studies. I had the pleasure to working with Rebecca, so today we're going to focus on challenges and opportunities in qual research. Our talk will be recorded and will be shared on YouTube after that. Okay, Rebecca, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much indeed, Shafag, and thank you to the network for inviting me to give this talk today. As Shafag said, I'm Rebecca Whiting. I'm a reader in organizational studies at the Birkbeck Business School, and I'm a specialist in qualitative methods. So I really welcome this opportunity to talk about the issue of assessment of quality in research, and hope to bring a sort of perhaps a slightly different perspective to that you might have encountered in the context of quantitative research. So what I'm going to run through this afternoon is to start by unpacking what we mean by qualitative research, because therein I think lies some of the issues in this particular area around quality criteria. I'll mention some of the debates that we've got in the field, some of the challenges for qualitative research, some of the opportunities, and also have a look at what good quality assessment practice in qualitative research might look like, and I'll offer some concluding thoughts. I was saying to Shafag at the beginning, I very much think that what I'm going to cover this afternoon is not in any way, shape or form a final word on this particular topic. It's very much, I think, for me at least, about opening a dialogue. So I'm very much looking forward to having a discussion afterwards. So let's, as I said, start by looking at what is qualitative research, because I think there is plenty of scope for a sort of only a very limited understanding by those who aren't specialists in qualitative methods. At its most basic, of course, qualitative research is non-numeric, and the data that we typically analyse can be spoken, written or visual. Any kind of meaning-making system can be analysed as data. And there's no single approach or method of data collection or analysis within qualitative methods. We do sometimes talk about a qualitative paradigm, and I'll say a little bit more about that, but it's actually underpinned by a range of different philosophical positions. So the ontology and epistemology of qualitative research can be very varied, and it's typically highly reflexive. Meaning that the researcher needs to reflect upon their own role in the research and the nature of it and the method. Methods are not neutral. So some sort of top line features of qualitative research: no stats, obviously, reflexive, as I've said, context sensitive. So the generation of very rich, deep data comes from research which is close to its context, natural settings generally. This is not sort of lab-based or experimental research. It's very much focused on people and what meanings are important to them and how they are constructed. And in the terms of analysis, we are looking for patterns across our data sets. And rather than us working from a hypothesis, from a theory, qualitative research tends to be theory generating. So I won't go through these now, but here are a couple of definitions of qualitative research, and the features that I've just highlighted on the previous slide are kind of drawn from these definitions. Victoria Clarke's definition, I think I used in the abstract for this talk, talks about qualitative research being a messy swamp, but that is, I think, an affectionate description on her part to pay tribute to the hugely divergent methods and traditions that constitute qualitative research. I mentioned that there's a big distinction which is important, and that is between big qual and small or little qual. And that can be defined as big qual representing qualitative research which is not underpinned by positivism. In other words, it doesn't hold to the ontological position of there being a sort of single objective reality. Big qual, on the other hand, is underpinned by a much more interpretive relativist position, often social constructionist. So these are non-positivist theories about the nature of reality and about the nature of knowledge and knowledge production. And within that, we have post-structuralism, postmodernism, a lot of critical inquiries, interpretivism. So that is the field in which I work, and that is the field in which I am much more familiar. There is, however, a branch of qualitative research which is called, as I said, often small qual to distinguish it from these non-positivist traditions, and which is associated with a more limited range of methods of data collection and is aligned with positivism and is often the type of qual that you might see in a mixed methods design. So this is a really important distinction when we come to look at assessment criteria. So a quick sort of side-by-side comparison of the differences between quant and qual, and I'm surfacing these because I think these are really important for thinking about quality and quality assessment criteria later on. So with qualitative, as I said, we have words and images rather than numbers. We seek to understand and interpret meanings close to their context, to their situation. We generate what might look like quite narrow data, so from quite small numerically, in numeric terms, data sets, but very rich, what's sometimes referred to as thick descriptions. When we come to analyze it, we're seeking patterns, but we accommodate to and explore differences within the data. Very often, that can be the start of new ideas for further research when you see what might in quantitative studies be regarded as outliers, where you perhaps get a small subset within your data of differences, things that can really pique your analytic attention, but are significant nonetheless, even though they might be a sort of minority part of the data set. As I mentioned, rather than theory testing and deductive, qualitative tends to be theory generating and inductive or abductive, which means we are alive to the possibility that our data sets will have within them data which we can develop in respect of new phenomena and to give the potential for the construction of new concepts and generating new theory. Indeed, I was presenting at a conference in September from a project that I started with some colleagues just before the pandemic, and we had conceived the project, a qualitative project, involving Church of England clergy in a particular way to investigate a particular research question of interest. But I found myself in September presenting a paper on the managerialism, resistance to managerialism by clergy during the pandemic, and found myself saying that neither managerialism nor resistance, nor indeed the pandemic, had ever been on our horizon when we started the project. So that sense of research not being deductive but inductive or abductive, of course, is really important. Very often you don't know exactly what you're going to find. And it's quite common for research to be gathered around a particular research aim, but perhaps for several research questions to be developed after the collection of data. So all of this, I'm sure you'll be thinking, is going to have some kind of relevance when we come to think about quality criteria. Whereas quantitative research values detachment and impartiality, often referred to as objectivity, qualitative values personal involvement and partiality, and these are often referred to through the concepts of subjectivity and reflexivity. Qualitative methods tend to be less fixed, partly because of the reasons I've outlined in terms of the inductive and abductive nature, and partly because we have such a wide range of different methods of data collection and data analysis. For that reason, it also tends to take longer because it is interpretive and there's no particular kind of formula that you can apply across all qualitative studies. So that kind of sets up what we're dealing with. Key in it, as I said, is that distinction between big qual and small qual, and the inductive or abductive nature of qualitative research. If we now turn to the debates in relation to assessment criteria, and this is an area where I'm sure members of the network are way ahead of me in terms of what even gave rise to forming the network in the first place, what we might is often referred to as the replication crisis. And this, put very simply, probably oversimplicity here, is about the fact that some studies in experimental psychology, but now a concern, I think, across wider social sciences, do not seem to be possible to replicate or reproduce. And there are other potentially related issues that get talked about under the same heading, specific practices in quantitative research around p-hacking and harking. I think you'll probably already see that these are going to be not really applicable to the form of qualitative research that I've defined. A publishing bias in favour of positive results, issues of fraud and paper retraction. Interestingly, Turish and Craig conclude that there are more instances of paper retraction for quantitative studies than qualitative, but their conclusion is that that's because quant dominates the field and there's more of them, not that qual is necessarily less susceptible to instances of bad practice or fraud. But all of this has created a renewed focus on the trustworthiness of research and how research practice can be enhanced and how we might be able to assess quality. Now, Hensel's recent paper comes to the conclusion that the one thing we can't do, even though there's a big debate about the extent to which quality standards can be applied universally, is that we can't ignore the problem. And part of the problem that Hensel identifies is that there are, as I said, conflicting views around what kind of quality criteria might apply to qualitative studies. The sort of typical deficiencies that are identified are often to do with a lack of methodological detail. So the Aguinas and Solarino paper says, I think it looked at something like 52 published interview studies and said that none of them contained enough methodological detail for them to be reproduced or replicated. Another criticism levelled is around the susceptibility to cherry picking. Again, this idea that perhaps qualitative researchers just pick selected data extracts and build their analysis around that. So Those are some sort of typical criticisms around quality that are levelled at qualitative research. And as I've said, in terms of Hensel synthesis, what we find are two different kind of competing responses to that issue, one of which says that we should allow for replication and reproduction studies in respect of qualitative research, which is defined rather broadly as any research which is non-experimental, and that would involve more or less taking criteria that are standard and pretty widely accepted as applicable to quantitative studies and applying them to qualitative. For example, things like the pre-registration of studies and encouraging greater transparency of methods and data, and the use of a sort of universal quality framework. And one of the ones that is well known, but I would suggest problematic, is what's called the Goya method. The alternative approach resists the idea that replication can be in any way, shape or form appropriate for qualitative studies because of the nature of qualitative research. And this is, I think, aligned to the big qual position. Qualitative research is defined much more specifically than just being non-experimental. The definitions encompass those I presented at the beginning of this talk and acknowledge the breadth of different philosophical underpinnings of qualitative research and the breadth of different methodologies within it. And this approach says replication is fundamentally inappropriate, but it accepts that transparency and trustworthiness are appropriate. The bottom line of this approach is to say we can't have a simplistic one method fits all kind of set of transparency standards. So where does that leave qualitative research? What are the challenges that it faces in light of these two kind of competing approaches to assessing quality? Well, as I've I think probably already hinted quite strongly, I think part of this comes from a limited understanding of qualitative research. Perhaps it's not so widely understood that there are these different, really distinct differences of flavour of qualitative, that the big difference being between big qual and little qual, but even within big qual, the myriad of different underpinning research philosophies and ways of thinking about ontology and epistemology, which of course then affect the kind of claims that are made in respect of findings from such research. So that breadth of philosophical paradigms, the different aims and claims that are made within it are fundamental. And within that, I think some of the push for a kind of one size fits all has come from a more North American qualitative tradition, which tends to be within the small qual. Whereas here in Europe, we have a much wider range of philosophical underpinnings that come from that European philosophical tradition. So Foucault and Derrida and Lacan and Gramsci and Marx, they have all contributed in very different ways, not with necessarily producing methodological toolkits, but with the way we problematize and conceptualize phenomena in respect of work and organizations or whatever. And that's led to the development of what's known as methodological bricolage, where we have to craft a methodological lens to be able to undertake our research. And we have to be very explicit about that and very reflexive about that. So there is an issue, I think, that perhaps, and perhaps this starts within universities and the teaching of research methods, that there is not necessarily a widespread specialist knowledge and training on the part of researchers, some of whom then, of course, take on reviewing and editorial roles in respect of qualitative methodologies. So that creates problems in respect of attempting to standardize research. The idea that you can make all aspects of the research cycle standard, and to make qualitative studies fit within publishing norms that have been developed for quantitative studies. So one of the big areas of that is, of course, word limits. Most journals don't distinguish between word limits for quantitative versus qualitative studies. In my own department, we have different word lengths for master's students' research dissertations. So we allow up to 8,000 for quantitative studies and up to 10 for qualitative, because we recognise the nature of qualitative research often needs more words to be able to describe it. Because of that methodological plurality, you can't just cite a particular study and say, yeah, we pretty much followed this. You're very much crafting a lens. And in reporting data, again, you're reporting words, or images, not numbers. And all of that takes words. And I, from personal experience, have seen within journal reviewing and editorial systems and submission systems, if you're submitting a paper as an author, that qualitative is rather problematically dealt with. It's very often assigned a kind of topic status within a journal, rather than it being a sort of filtering lens of expertise. So as an associate editor of a journal, I was trying to put in my sort of areas of expertise, and qualitative came up in that list, along with sort of other things which are much more topic-based, like work-life boundaries or well-being or something like that. But it meant it didn't pre-filter requests to review. So I was getting quantitative papers to review about work-life boundaries. And I kept saying, but I'm a qualitative scholar. I don't review quantitative. And there was nothing within the journal systems that could apply that level of filtering. And I do think that makes a difference, particularly as someone who's had papers reviewed by people who I think are probably quantitative, whereas I wouldn't do that in reverse. So fitting quality criteria to type of research, a lot of the criteria were designed for deductive methodologies, so concepts like reliability and validity. Whereas I think it can be argued very convincingly, quality assessment needs to be appropriate and consistent with the type of research, rather than conforming to standards that might be applicable to positivist research, but not more widely. Hence the debate we find ourselves in today in terms of what criteria should apply to qualitative research. And as I said, what we end up with is the inappropriate application of positivist research quality criteria to qualitative research. And I think that must come from a sort of assumption that all qual is positivist, and that a standard quality framework is universally applicable. But the moment you start to think about what qualitative research looks like, what qualitative data looks like, how qualitative research is designed, the more problematic it becomes. So in the context of open science, qualitative data is highly contextualized and often deeply personal, and generally not appropriate for data sharing. If you were to share it, you would have to, and I think the technical term is scrub it, of all its identifiers to protect the confidentiality and anonymity of the participants. But in doing so, you render it sort of contextualless. No, that's not the right word. Well, you decontextualize it. And then it becomes meaningless, because the whole point about qualitative research is that it's very research context specific. So we can begin to see there are some problems with the universal application of a set of standard quality criteria, and the sort of growing proliferation of different competing quality criteria. And we begin to see the problematic application of this in the review process. So I have also been through a review process where reviewers were clearly seeking something akin to the Goya methodology to be applied inappropriately to a particular piece of research. And that takes time in the review process to go back and essentially kind of educate your reviewers as to why that's not applicable or appropriate. It has reached the point now where very well-known qualitative researchers, Brown and Clarke, and their recent book on thematic analysis, have taken to crafting what they call reflexive thematic analysis bingo. In other words, these are things that you might see in a review of your qualitative research using their particular form of data analysis, and why these are just deeply inappropriate. So criticizing qualitative research for its lack of generalizability, mentions of saturation, mentions of bias, asking you for your code book, asking about intercoder reliability. All of these are problematic within a big qual framework. So it has reached the point where, you know, this has become something almost of an in-joke within those of us who do big qual. So let's think about some opportunities. I think editors and reviewers obviously are important gatekeepers in facilitating, or let's hope not, but potentially diminishing quality in qualitative research. I have to say, wearing my reviewer and associate editor hat, I have rejected an awful lot of qualitative papers from a particular journal because they simply did not meet any kind of appropriate quality standards. So I'm not in any way, shape or form saying anything goes with qualitative research, quite the contrary. But I have, as I said, also experienced the reverse, where I felt reviewers were not sufficiently familiar with what were appropriate criteria for assessing a particular piece of qualitative research. So better journal, reviewer and topic databases that can capture the use and expertise in qualitative methods would, I think, be a real step in the right direction. I am a firm believer in staying in one's lane. As I said, I would never review a quantitative paper. Researchers at all career stages can become better educated in qualitative research and in therefore being able to apply appropriate criteria. And I think that starts in universities with teaching research methods. I think it's a really important part of our roles as educators that our students leave a master's course with a good understanding of both quantitative and qualitative methods. And then we can be part of a community that can develop and apply quality criteria for big qual that is paradigm commensurate. So I'm now going to just look at some examples of frameworks that have been developed. I did warn you that there's quite a few, so I'm not going to go through all of them in depth. What I've done is to give you some pointers to what they are, and then I'm going to go through some of the kind of common criteria and unpack those a little bit to give you a flavour of the sort of commonalities over these different frameworks that we've got. So Wilhelmy and Kohler, specifically in the field of organizational psychology, have developed a set of quality considerations for qualitative research. You'll see here a reference to methodological bricolage again, but what they have sought to do is to keep the aspects of quality very closely aligned with the type of aims and features of qualitative research. So these quality criteria that you see on the left are going to look quite different to some of the quality criteria that you might be familiar with from quantitative methods. Another framework has come from Levitt and colleagues. I believe this is from a working party that was set up by the American Psychological Association, specifically to look at developing appropriate criteria for assessing quality in qualitative research. And this is largely focused on data collection and data analysis, and they use the twin ideas of fidelity and utility as their sort of organizing principles. There are many other quality frameworks out there. Tracy's work from a decade or so back, her 8 big tent criteria. These are topics like rigor, sincerity, credibility, resonance, significance, ethics, coherence, and having a worthy topic. Berworth's transparency checklist. So transparency is a sort of common criteria that you see across these different frameworks. They've developed a checklist for qualitative researchers in helping you to ensure good transparency in your research design. Lucy Yardley's work goes back sort of 10 or 15 years now, about quality principles, and the idea is that her principles are relatively flexible in terms of how they can be applied. So again, anticipating that wide range of different underpinning paradigms and methodologies within qual. Michael Pratt and colleagues, North American approach here. Again, we see the word bricolage. That seems to be the flavour of the month at the moment. An approach to conducting trustworthy qualitative research. So again, transparency and trustworthy are recurring themes in these frameworks. And Brown and Clarke, whose 2021 book I've mentioned on reflexive thematic analysis, their strategies that they identify are in relation to that particular method of a data analysis, but it's a method that is very widely used and a very flexibly applied framework for data analysis because it fits within a number of different paradigms. So what I've done is to look in a bit of detail at all those different frameworks and try to work out from them the kind of commonalities. And I've split these across, if you like, the sort of different parts of the research cycle. And I start with the researcher. So in positivist research, the idea of researcher objectivity and the elimination of bias in the researcher and across the research design are considered important. But in qualitative research, big qual, what we position as significant is subjectivities, that sense of being aware through one's own reflexive practice of what you know, understand, and think about a phenomena that you are investigating. The idea of complete objectivity is therefore, you know, not a criteria that's going to be applicable. And the idea that your perspective as a researcher can be managed to enhance fidelity is part of the Levitt framework. And that's about really trying to harness what you as an individual researcher can bring to the research process, but being fully aware and transparent about that as part of the research design. And critical reflexivity, again, is that sense of bringing to each stage of the research process the opportunity to think about the decisions that you have made in crafting your research design, in the methodological bricolage that you've put together in crafting that sort of lens for examining the topic that you're studying. So if you think about research design, there's a multitude of decisions. So being transparent and open about that decision-making process throughout, and of particular importance when it comes to analysis, is part of how we build trustworthiness into our research. In terms of topic and design, where quant is often sort of the starting point for quant is often sort of spotting a gap that's, you know, worthy of investigation and developing a research question that might test a hypothesis that's come from a particular theory. Sandberg and Alverson have highlighted how we can get richer, perhaps more interesting research questions, not necessarily through spotting a gap, although these are not mutually exclusive, but by problematizing the assumptions that underpin existing research, and that can lead to the generation of more meaningful research questions and the possibility of generating new theory. Again, having a worthy topic, so I think that's a sort of shared criteria. Possibly publicly sharing materials as part of the drive for transparency. The issue here, however, is around things like interview protocols. And I've taken part in a study where we made a website available of all the legacy documents, all the participant-facing information sheets, instructions to do a video diary, interview protocol, so the list of questions. The problem is a lot of interviews are going to be what's called semi-structured. And that means that the researcher has to be sensitive to what comes back during the interview process. So beyond just kind of probing and having follow-up questions, you sometimes have to follow where your participant is going, because something that they've said might take the interview off in a slightly different direction. So I think it's not a reason not to publish them, but I think it has to be read against a background of understanding that interviews tend not to follow an exact script in terms of what the researcher says, and certainly not what comes back from the participants. In terms of topics like sort of crystallization, which Tracy has as one of her sort of criteria. This is the ability to be able to capture the multifaceted, complex understanding of a particular phenomena, the idea that there isn't one single objective reality in respect of something, but that we can only get a partial view, and that's referred to as crystallization. In terms of criteria in respect of methodology, now sometimes we see suggestions that, for example, when you've done your analysis as a qualitative researcher, you should go back and check with members, in other words, the participants who you interviewed or who completed a qualitative survey or whatever, and see if I'm going to pause there. What is it that we're going back to check? We have done our expert data analysis as qualitative researchers. Unless your analysis is going to be constructed using ideas and themes that the participants themselves recognize from their own language, I don't think it's appropriate to go back and ask them to check. In fact, it might be quite unethical and counterproductive, because you might be using terms and concepts and ideas that might be quite alien and possibly rather disconcerting to them. So that isn't a criteria that can be universally applied. There is something called member reflections, and that is a more universal criteria that we can adopt, which is where you might present back to your participants some early analysis after you've done perhaps a couple of iterations of coding and the development of themes, and present some initial findings back to them for them to then consider and discuss with you, and then you can incorporate their reflections back into a further round of analysis. Participant validation, again, only really if you're using terms in your analysis that the participants would recognise. I mean, to put it in slightly simplistic terms, you probably wouldn't send your SPSS output to participants who'd taken part in a survey study. So why would we do it in qualitative research? Trustworthiness. really core criteria, but Pratt and others who have developed these frameworks for assessing big qualitative research are all keen to stress that it can't be some sort of rigid one-size-fits-all methodological template. And transparency, again, this in practical terms is, I think, one of the areas that we struggle with as qualitative researchers, that we simply don't often have the space to be as transparent as we would like when we're writing up. I thought in a complex study that I did that involved video diaries and interviews and debriefs, that if we published a methods paper first, it would be simple when we came to publish empirical papers, because we'd be able to kind of point back to the methods paper. Of course, when sort of, double-blind review, you can't do that. Even if the editor knows about the paper's existence, you can't draw specific attention to it. So that was perhaps slightly naive of me. But it, in the end, it hasn't helped in the review process. It probably has helped overall in terms of the publications and being able to point to a place where we can give much more detail. So somebody interested in the method can go back to the methods paper and see a much fuller account of what we did, rather than having to repeat it in each empirical paper. But it's a constant struggle to deliver that level of transparency. And then in terms of the application of findings, there are certain terms which I think are beginning to come to a higher profile, things like information power. So whereas quant has needs a certain statistical power to be able to rely on a sort of a statistical analysis of data, in qual we can harness what's called information power. So in other words, the sort of narrower the question and the type of participant that you're looking at, the fewer you need to be able to deliver information power. The broader the kind of criteria for participation and topic, the more you would need. And different types of generalizability. So many times I see a limitation of qualitative research being that it's not generalizable. Well, it's not statistically generalizable, but there are different forms of generalizability: flexible, idiographic, naturalistic, which I think offer other forms of generalizing from qualitative research, which are useful and helpful, and I think have lend power to the type of research that qualitative designs can deliver. So being able to kind of recognize a phenomena from a paper, even though the participant group might be different to a particular occupational setting, doesn't mean to say that the findings can't be generalized if you've got good naturalistic generalizability. And that sense of being able to transfer findings from one contextual setting to another by giving rich descriptions of context, by having very rich detailed data, the reader can then make quite a sort of sensitive judgment around the extent to which findings can be generalized to another setting. And we see that, in terms of how papers get cited in qualitative research. And then generally credibility and trustworthiness. Again, the skill here is to be able to show that through the interpretive analysis and the context that is given in terms of the data. So a few concluding thoughts. It has been a bit of a whistle-stop tour, and as I said, I hope this is the start of a dialogue. I'm not saying anything here by way of a sort of final word on this particular topic. I do, however, think there needs to be a shared language. So some concepts that might be common to quantitative and qualitative, like generalizability, in fact, we need to kind of learn a little bit more about what each of us thinks about that and where the differences might be and where the commonalities might be. I think we need to consider our roles, particularly as educators, but also as researchers and reviewers. And I think I'd sort of like to throw this open for a bit of a discussion and consider what next steps you might take as a result of hearing from me this afternoon. Finally, I'm going to share with you a couple of images. The one on the left is what I conceive visually, because I like visual data, as quantitative research. And the one on the right is how I conceive of qualitative research. Now, I fully accept when you're sometimes reading a qual paper, you might think that it looks a bit like that. But what you can't do is to say, but it's got to have wheels, you know, and try to get it to at least look like that. We're looking at two very different beasts here. So a plea to recognise qualitative has distinct features and needs to have some distinct quality criteria too. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Rebecca. That was so insightful, as I anticipated, and really makes you want to find out more, to learn more about this. And yeah, obviously there's so much that resonates there. I'm working on a paper, and I decided to do some analysis of paper using the same method. In the last few years, I reviewed about 24 papers, and guess what? Goya framework. It's like most of them, yeah.
Yes. It's hard to get away, and those North Americans, you know, they can be quite pervasive. It's I literally had a paper published yesterday, and that was there was a bit of a fight in the reviewing stages to resist Goya.
Oh wow. Oh,
yeah, not named as such, but we could see, and that's why I say, you know, that language that's used here is so important. We could kind of detect a little bit about where that was coming from.
All right, that's so good to know. Thank you. Yeah, I'm inviting our participants to ask their questions, please. I may go. Yeah, sorry. Yes, Katie, please. Yeah.
Hi, thank you so much for that presentation. It was great. I'm quite early on in my research career, but it was really handy to hear some of the information, and I liked the way that you explained that kind of qualitative is theory generating. It's good to just kind of differentiate it. I wondered, at the minute I'm doing some thematic analysis, and I wondered if you used any kind of software that you've found to be particularly helpful when you're analysing different themes within qualitative work at all that you wouldn't mind sharing?
Of course, yes. So I have used NVivo. It's quite an expensive piece of software, although they do have sort of student licenses that run for a year, which are a little bit cheaper, and your own institution can tell you when maybe you might have a site license, but we don't at Birkbeck. It is useful, but it's not necessary, would be my advice. And there is some interesting work using a macro that you can run in Microsoft Word, which does much the same for the first sort of 2 or 3 stages of thematic analysis, and which is completely free. I don't think I've got the reference that I can cut and paste into the chat, but I'm happy to send it to Shafag after this afternoon for onwards sharing, because that's completely open source. It doesn't cost anything. It doesn't, none of the software kind of does the analysis for you. And indeed, Brown and Clarke are evangelical that themes do not emerge. They are, you know, developed actively by the researcher. But this word macro, I think it could be quite a sort of zero cost, fairly low sort of entry point for creating a structure for thematic analysis, or at least the first kind of 2 or 3 rounds of coding.
Okay, that's really helpful. Thank you. And it's reassuring to know that you don't have to use software, because I wasn't planning to, but I just wondered what your thoughts were about it. Thanks.
I quite like the analog approach, which involves lots of highlighter pens and sticky bits of post-it note, and yeah, being able to visualize it, I think, is really important. So it's worth trying out different techniques. And there is, with a really big data set, there is something nice about being able to do a kind of word search. Once you've got an idea, to kind of, you know, look for a particular word and synonyms automatically. But for a smaller scale project, it's absolutely not essential.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you both. We have a question from Melanie.
I was just going to say thank you so much. I've really enjoyed the session.
Thank you.
We do have a site, NVivo license.
Wow.
I think it's, if you go, Katie, if you go into the UEA catalogue, you know, the one that we can download, I think it's there. I'm sure it is.
Someone's put "but we do" in the chat, so I'm guessing that's a reference to the to a site license. Yeah. I mean,
but I'm like you, Rebecca. When I did my master's, I definitely highlighting pens, and I quite enjoy that because you really get to know and understand what you're reading as well. I found it helped me in that way. I really got to grips with the data more than I would have, I think, if I'd have used a software program. I don't know.
There's no shortcut to data familiarization, which is always the first step in any qualitative analysis, and there's no shortcut to sitting there and immersing yourself in the data. It's the challenge I've had on the study where we used video diaries and interviews was, unlike an interview where you're there present, so you have a recollection of the event because you've been with the participant at the time, you've been asking them questions. With video diaries that participants create, you have no idea what's going to come back in that data, so it's all a surprise. And so the familiarization sort of starts one step further back, because you were not there when the data was kind of created, and that is quite time consuming to then sort of get familiar with and then to analyze it.
Yeah, I'm studying for my Ed.D at the moment, so I'm going to be doing mixed methods, so I'm falling into your small qual category. But I assume that everything would still apply, that you...
Yes, I think again, being reflexive about your philosophical underpinning, you know, the ontology and the epistemology, and then finding criteria that align with that, I think is really important. So what I was trying to do in the last few slides was to pull out what I think are kind of common across the different frameworks. And, you know, some specific aspects might not be so appropriate. So I think the participant validation, for example, or sometimes called member checking, if you're doing like a content analysis or something like that, then you could go back, because you're going to be using language that very much maps onto what participants perhaps have used, and they would expect to be able to see something that they recognize in that level of the analysis. If you're using anything more reflexive, or a much more sophisticated form of analysis like discourse analysis or narrative analysis, you're taking participant data and you're looking across the data set. So you're often not drawing just on one participant, but you're looking for patterns across the data set in terms of what a whole group of people might have talked about, and therefore they're not, that what they might look for isn't going to be there because that's not what you've done. And so, as I said, to me that would be as odd as sending them your SPSS output and going, what do you think about that? You know, it's like, No, I don't think that's
Sure.
appropriate. So yeah, I think, as I said, look to what is commensurate with the framework that you're using for your research.
Okay, thank you.
And I saw there's a question in the chat. What's generative AI like at thematic analysis? Well, I have no idea. Does anybody know what it's like? Has it attempted it? It probably has. I spent most of last year teaching learning and development and trying to work out what the implications of AI were in that field. I haven't, I have to say, yet turned my attention to what it might be doing in terms of qualitative analysis. But yeah, let's watch this space. If anybody finds out, I'd be super interested.
Right. Yeah, I love the SPSS analogy. I think I'm going to use it. Yeah, I just wanted to ask you to elaborate on the assessment, on the debates, on the assessment criteria. Any specific assessment criteria that you find particularly problematic or particularly valuable in this regard, Rebecca?
I think the framework, it's not a framework, perhaps it's a little bit overstating it, but the principles that Michael Pratt and his colleagues published in 2021, I think are really useful, because they go to some trouble to kind of highlight what's problematic about replication and reproducibility in respect of qualitative research, as well as offering sort of modes to enhance sort of trustworthiness and sort of transferability. I think some of Gillian Simon's work, some of which predates this kind of most recent kind of conflict between these different competing frameworks, is helpful, because it sort of sets the scene and gives us the insight into why we shouldn't be going down the route of trying to find a kind of one size fits all. And that's really paying tribute, as I said, to the history of European philosophical traditions and that sense of crafting a methodological lens, which is so fundamental in qualitative research. And I think understanding why there are these tensions helps us to be able to make sense of what we're seeing. It gives us the tools for, criticality when it comes to looking at some of these kind of template ideas of one size fits all. We can, if we know why they're problematic, it's easier to kind of say, well, that clearly is, not appropriate. So let's park that on one side and focus on the ones that we can do. I think the Yardley and the Tracy frameworks are also useful, but it's about, sort of setting out some some commonalities that look across the different kind of competing frameworks. That's what I was trying to do in the sort of last part of the talk. And no, there's, as ever with qual, there's no real shortcut ever. But I think it's a super interesting issue, and I'm really glad to have been a very small part of the debate this afternoon. And I hope, given people some ideas for their own research, and also perhaps for those of us who find ourselves in a reviewing or editorial capacity. I do very strongly feel about, staying in one's lane. And, there are a lot of people out there with qualitative expertise, but equally I understand editors face issues trying to find reviewers for papers. So again, it's another tension there. This is not a perfect world.
Yeah, I can't resist the temptation to ask you, as a reviewer and associate editor, what would you like to see the most in qual papers?
a longer word length for one. that would help people tell me more about their own positioning and their sort of the reflexive aspect of the choices that they've made in their research design and their analysis. I often feel that the whole method section often gets super compressed with tantalizing bits of detail. And I think I'd like to see less qual offered as a, oh, here's some interesting bits of data. We didn't really know what to do with them. There wasn't anything we could do kind of quantitatively, so we've kind of analysed them qualitatively, but we're not quite sure. Yeah, less of that and more qual that comes from a position of, you know, this is what we want to do, because it's the best way of tackling what we want to investigate. You know, so a very deliberate positioning, and I think, you know, space for those discussions, as I've indicated this afternoon, that sometimes the project does not turn out to be the project that you thought you were going to be conducting, or at least it has many more facets within it. You know, the Digital Brain Switch project was looking at how digital technologies affected how people switched, you know, between different work and life roles. But some of it had to be abductive, because we found things in the videos that we hadn't expected to see, and the whole concept of digi housekeeping came out of that. You know, it was a new phenomena, and yeah, I mean, that's one of the great things about qual is what you can find.
Well, yeah, thanks very much. I think I could go on and on and on. I'm mindful of your time. Thanks so much, everyone, for participating. I'm immensely pleased that we had Rebecca today, and in a way, we are pioneering this dialogue or debate on that. I'm so UEA's and Rebecca's contribution, UEA's contribution to this dialogue is going to be enormous. So I am recording the conversation. I will be sharing it through our social media accounts, and I will share a social media account in the chat